Darkness. That's all Jay saw. He didn't know where he was. Didn't know how he got there. Panic welled up inside him. He tried to remember. Nothing. He forced his eyes open. A dull ache pulsed in his head. He was in his apartment. Relief washed over him, brief and fleeting. Something was wrong. The room was dark, unusually dark. He tried to switch on the lights. No power. He stumbled to the window. Outside, the city was eerily silent. He reached for his phone. Dead. A cold dread crept into his heart. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten in how long? He didn't know. He rummaged through his empty cupboards. Despair threatened to consume him. He collapsed on the floor, his head in his hands. That's when he felt it, a warmth in his chest, spreading outwards. He looked down. A soft light emanated from his hands. He willed it away. The light faded. He focused, bringing his hands together. The light returned, stronger this time. And then it happened. A loaf of bread materialized between his palms. Warm, fresh, impossible. He stared at it, his mind reeling. He had to find out what was going on. The city, once bustling with life, now lay eerily silent. The questions swirled in his mind like a storm. Where had everyone gone? What had happened to the vibrant energy that used to fill these streets? He left his apartment, the loaf of bread clutched tightly in his hand. It was a simple comfort, a reminder of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become anything but normal. The bread was still warm, a small miracle in the midst of chaos. The hallway was deserted. An unsettling silence hung in the air. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a thunderclap, amplifying the emptiness that surrounded him. He could almost hear the whispers of the past, the laughter and conversations that once filled this space. Outside, the streets were empty. Cars sat abandoned. Some crashed into each other. It was as if time had stopped, freezing the city in a moment of panic and confusion. The sight was surreal, like a scene from a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. A thick layer of dust covered everything. It was like the city had been deserted for weeks, months even. The dust was a testament to the passage of time, to the days and nights that had gone by without a single soul to disturb it. It settled on everything, a silent witness to the city's abandonment. He walked for hours. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. Each step was a reminder of his solitude, a stark contrast to the lively chatter that once filled these streets. He wandered aimlessly, hoping to find a sign, a clue, anything that could explain the emptiness. The weight of his loneliness pressed down on him. It was a heavy burden, one that grew with each passing moment. The city, once a place of connection and community, now felt like a prison of isolation. He longed for the comfort of another's presence, for the simple joy of a shared smile. He had the power to create food, but what good was it in a ghost town? The ability that once brought him pride now felt like a cruel joke. He could conjure feasts, but there was no one to share them with. The abundance of food only highlighted the scarcity of companionship. He wondered if he would ever find another soul, or if he was destined to wander this empty city alone forever. He spotted movement in the distance. A flicker of hope ignited within him. A young woman huddled in the doorway of a shop. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt. She looked up at him, fear in her eyes. He ran towards it, his heart pounding. He stopped a few feet away, raising his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse from disuse. She flinched at the sound, scrambling back. He lowered his gaze, pain stabbing at his chest. He wasn't used to this, to seeing fear in someone's eyes. He held out the loaf of bread, his hands trembling slightly. The bread was fresh, its aroma wafting through the air, a promise of sustenance in a world that had long forgotten the taste of kindness. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were gentle, filled with a sincerity that was hard to find in these harsh times. "I just want to help." His words hung in the air, a lifeline in the sea of despair that surrounded them. He knew what it was like to be alone, to be hungry, to be afraid. She stared at the bread, her eyes widening with a mixture of hope and disbelief. It had been so long since she had seen something so simple, yet so precious. He could practically smell the hunger radiating off of her. He knew that hunger. He felt it too. It gnawed at his insides, a constant reminder of the world they lived in. "Where?" she croaked, her voice raspy from days, maybe weeks of disuse. Her throat burned with the effort, but she had to know. "Where did you get that?" He hesitated. Could he trust her? Could she trust him? The world had made them both wary, but he had to take a chance. He had to believe in something better. He couldn't survive this alone. The loneliness was as suffocating as the hunger. He needed her as much as she needed him. "I made it," he said quietly. Her eyes widened further. "Made it?" The concept seemed foreign, almost impossible. In a world where survival was the only goal, creating something as simple as bread felt like a miracle. She looked from the bread to him, disbelief etched on her face. How could he have made it? Where did he find the ingredients? The questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to voice them. He took a step closer, holding the bread out to her. His heart pounded in his chest. This was a moment of trust, a fragile bridge between two lost souls. It's real. You can have it. His voice was filled with hope, a hope that she would take the bread, that she would trust him, that they could find a way to survive together. The bread was more than just food. It was a promise of a future, a promise of companionship, a promise of hope. She tentatively reached out, her fingers brushing against his. He didn't let go. He wouldn't let go. She devoured the bread in a matter of seconds, her eyes never leaving his. When she was done, she looked up at him, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Hannah," she whispered. "I'm Jay," he said. "Come with me, Hannah. We can help each other." And so they set off together, two souls searching for meaning in a world that had seemingly ended. They found a small grocery store untouched by the chaos. They made it their safe haven. Days turned into weeks. Jay found others, lost souls, starving, desperate. They wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail. The world had changed, and so had they. He offered them food, shelter, and hope. Their numbers grew. What started as a small group soon became a community. They built makeshift homes, shared stories, and found solace in each other's company. He learned more about what had happened. A virus. It wasn't just any virus. It was something unprecedented. It spread rapidly, leaving chaos in its wake. It swept through the world, turning people into something else. They weren't just sick, they were transformed. Their humanity stripped away, replaced by a primal hunger. Creatures driven by an insatiable hunger. They roamed the streets, their eyes wild, their movements erratic. They were relentless, always searching, always hungry. They called them food zombies. The name seemed almost comical at first, but there was nothing funny about them. They were a constant threat, always lurking, always waiting. They weren't like the zombies in the movies. They didn't crave flesh. They didn't want to tear you apart. Their hunger was different, more insidious. They craved food, any food. It didn't matter what it was. Bread, fruit, even scraps. They would do anything to get it. And they were drawn to it. The scent of food was like a beacon, calling them, guiding them. It was their only focus, their only desire. The first sign came at night. The air was still, the world quiet. But there was a tension, a sense of impending danger, a scratching at the door. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more persistent, soft at first, then more insistent. Jay's heart raced. He knew what it was, but he hoped he was wrong. Jay pressed his ear against the cold metal. The sound was unmistakable, a low, guttural growl. A low growl sent shivers down his spine. It was a sound he had come to dread, a sound that meant danger was near. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The night was far from over, and the real fight was just beginning. He looked back at the others. Hannah, his rock, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. The others, faces pale, gripped whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The growling grew louder. More joined in, a chorus of hunger. Jay felt a tremor run through the floor. They were trying to break in. "We have to fight," Hannah whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to protect this place." Jay nodded. He had to be strong. For them, he was their leader, their protector. He held his hands out, focusing his energy. Food. He needed more food. The doors burst open. A wave of decaying flesh and rotting teeth surged in. Their eyes, devoid of humanity, locked onto Jay. He was their target, their source. He hurled loaves of bread, fruits, anything he could create, into their midst. They fell upon the food with frenzied hunger, momentarily distracted. But it wouldn't be enough. He could feel it. Their hunger was a bottomless pit, and he was the only one who could fill it. The others fought bravely, their fear replaced by a desperate will to survive. But they were outnumbered, outmatched. Jay fought alongside them, his powers growing stronger with each passing moment. He was a beacon, drawing the creatures to him, away from the others. He wouldn't let them down. He wouldn't let them become like those things. He would protect them. He had to. As the night wore on, the tide began to turn. Exhaustion claimed the creatures one by one, their bodies collapsing in on themselves, consumed by the very hunger that drove them. By dawn, the grocery store stood silent once more. The survivors, battered and bruised, surveyed the carnage around them. They had survived, for now. Jay looked at the faces around him. He saw gratitude, he saw fear, but most of all, he saw hope. The hope that he had given them. the hope that they clung to in this new, terrifying world. He knew this was only the beginning. The food zombies were out there. Their hunger would never be satiated, and he, Jay, the boy who could create infinite food, was their only hope. His journey had just begun.